Welcome to the Pivot Point podcast. This season, I'm focused on sharing stories and ideas from experts on diversity and inclusion. In this episode, I will share some insights and ideas from my guest expert, Kate Isler. Together, we will leave you with some actionable tips to think about and discuss with your organization. We share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. And next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together. We are one. So I'm going to introduce Kate. Kate comes to us with over 20 years of international executive leadership experience. She gained in working with Fortune 100 companies and startups and has now turned her passion for supporting gender parity into a thriving business. She is the co-founder and CEO of Be Bold Now, a conscious consulting practice whose mission is to build an intersectional community of women and men who strive to inspire, empower, and support each other to take bold, pragmatic action to accelerate gender parity and support the UN Sustainable Development Goals. She's a change agent, a thought leader, and her experience in high tech as a CEO of a digital health startup, as well as an executive at Microsoft, where she spent many years living and working overseas. She provides a powerful platform of real-world expertise and examples to draw from when addressing gender equity and balanced management practices. In her leadership journey, she challenges the status quo, helps people overcome adversity and breaking gender stereotypes, and motivates and inspires audiences. She successfully navigated the complexity of a global company and tested her agility and ability to innovate as an entrepreneur. She also published a book and completed her memoir, which is to be released by HarperCollins Leadership in 2020. And she's a mentor for the International Women's Forum and is also serving on the global board of Girl Rising and several startup advisory boards. Wow, Kate, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Julie. It's great to be here.
Wow, what a wealth of experience you're going to bring. So we're going to talk about the international piece, which I know you're passionate about, sharing your travels abroad and the experiences that were unique and different to you. Before we do that and dig in to your take on diversity and inclusion as well, how did you decide you wanted to do this work?
It was really interesting. I always think I worked in technology for about 200 years is how I think of it. And from that point, I experienced sort of the best and the worst of being a female in a high-tech industry. And, after kind of running up against a bunch of bias and some challenges, a very good friend of mine said, let's celebrate International Women's Day in the US. And so we hosted an event. It started with 80 people and we've grown to over 500 and it's
Wow.
blossomed into a business.
Wow. Isn't it amazing how when you surround yourself with good people and you have a goal and an intention, how it thrives, it grows?
It is, it's been amazing because the genesis of International Women's Day, it's been around for over 100 years. And it is really to recognize and celebrate women across our contributions culturally, socially, economically. And I just think that there is so much room to celebrate and acknowledge one another that I'm on a mission to make that big and important and something that is well known across this country.
Yeah. It's interesting doing this line of work. It's only been a few years since I've been aware of International Women's Day. And I was a women's studies minor in college. I've been passionate about women's rights for many years. So many new wrinkles I am continuously curious about and learning, and I'm sure I'm going to learn from you today, Kate. With that in mind, I know you spent a lot of time overseas and you've worked for the big Fortune 100 companies. Help us understand, what was it like to be outside the United States? What was unique about your experience? And maybe how does that help you with the work you do today?
So it was really unique. When I started, it was because a man that worked in the company that I knew went to Europe. And I thought, wait a minute, if he can do that, I'm going to do that. And so I raised my hand and the company said, great, how about the Middle East? And I was like, wait a minute, I thought Paris or London.
Right.
Yeah, I was like, oh. And so I talked my husband into spending 2 years. I promised him it would be 2 years if he quit his job and we could go and have this big adventure. Well, 20 years and 3 kids later, we came back to the US.
Wow. And you shared with me that The infamous question that you were asked while overseas. What was that, Kate?
Did you bring your family? I was a bit
Mhm.
of an anomaly for sure in technology and a woman in a leadership position. And I was called on to bring sort of that corporate environment because I came from corporate. And so there was a lot of question about, how do we do these things? And, what's the position and the culture of the company? And so I spoke a lot and would always be questioned in meetings when customers and coworkers and partners would find out that I was from corporate and they'd say, "Oh, well, did you bring your family?" And it was really interesting because they would never ask a man that
Right.
because it's assumed if you're an expat, you're generally a two-parent family.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
the other thing I was so amazed about was some of the worst was the women in either the office or at schools or in social settings would always ask that and be so amazed that how could you possibly bring your family. And it was the advantage of working overseas is a little bit you can make your own path because it was unexpected and it was
Mhm.
interest. And so I truly use that to say, of course I did. And here is how I did it. And, I conducted business and I don't know that I ever thought there were limits on it.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
just did it.
Well, I remember my early days that I referenced quite a bit on the podcast and great experiences I had at Caterpillar, which was a big global company, much like the companies you worked
Mhm.
for. And global experience was really important, but you had to kind of get to that mid-career salary grade to have that global international experience. And so you really started to see men and women separate here for a lot of the reasons you're talking about. Not that women didn't want to bring their families overseas. There's kind of like this negative stigma to it of like, oh, wow, you're going to uproot your whole family for your career, you selfish woman. Men just don't have that same stereotype applied to them. And that's not at all how I believe. Um, but it was interesting. We were at the time, this is early 2000s, they were starting to get better at it and communicating and messaging on the education is better. Not necessarily better, but they provided an elevated level of education outside of the central Illinois area where I was. And
Mhm.
they were really encouraging women to put that in their development plan. So I was encouraged to do that at this point. You need to do this. But for a number of years, that wasn't encouraged, and there was this backlash of the motherhood penalty, bias, which we know to affect women adversely in the workplace, and it's that flip it to test it. If you'd ask a man that, that's okay, but if you wouldn't, think about how ridiculous that would be to
Mhm.
ask a man that.
It was really interesting. I had even executives be surprised when they would show up in our subsidiaries and I would be there to greet them. That was a thing. They would go, "Oh my gosh, we didn't know who you were and why you would be here." I was like,
They
"Well,
didn't know what to do with you, Kate.
uh-huh, why would we?" And the other interesting thing was as when we talked about benefits and we talked about expat moving, as you said, the packages and all of those things, there's a consideration in many of these big companies for wives
Mhm.
and helping them, and they were completely at a loss of what to do with my husband.
What was his experience like?
It was really interesting because he had a very difficult time that I don't think either one of us thought through because he had no communities. Certainly in the Middle East, he was the only trailing male spouse for
Mhm.
years, I'm quite sure. And when you're in the Middle East, a woman at the time, and I don't know that that's changed, could not sponsor a family. So I couldn't sponsor him on my visa, my son on my visa. He couldn't bank on my banking account. And so it was really difficult. He lived on a tourist visa for about a year and would have to leave. He and my son would have to leave the country for 2 or 3 days at a time every 2 months and come
Oh
back.
my
And it
gosh.
finally ended up that the company had to give him an employment contract to make him
Wow.
whole so that he could do business and we could be equal. It was really interesting. It was sort of you think about the cultural nuance here and you think about the cultural nuance in the Middle East.
Hmm.
It's a really interesting thing to consider.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that with me because I think a lot of times people used to have remember the adage where you'd say, behind every strong man is a strong woman. I
Mhm.
joke, behind a lot of strong women are a lot of strong men that, that takes a strong man to kind of forgo being the provider and, to be the trailing spouse in a culture where that's not the norm and to be the exception. And I still see that here in the US, even though I believe the latest statistics are men are the primary caregivers, I think 15 to 20% of the time. So still, we
Mhm.
have a long way to go here in the States. But the more that we see that as an example that it's okay for men to be the primary caregivers, it really gives women the freedom in their careers. I myself, my husband stays at home, and
Mhm.
it's amazing the things that people say to him. It's, "What do you really do?" Like, they cannot, like, get their head around the fact that he stays at home, and then it really throws them for a loop when he says he supports my business. Like, "What? You do what? You support a women's leadership business? Like, that's definitely not a real job." And so, there's this backlash from men that I think when we put people in these gender boxes, it is not good for anybody. Like, you feel like you have to fit in or get out, and it's just I'm sure that was hard for both of you, but on the other side of it, Kate, I know you have had tremendous success, and now it's led to the launch of your business. And I'm curious, what experiences do you bring with you? What stories from the days abroad or in the corporate world do you see still happening in the corporate world today? And maybe what would you offer as kind of lessons learned on your story and how it translates to what you teach around gender parity?
Well, it's a really interesting thing because I think that we have such a skewed view of gender parity in business today. I think there's a huge gap in what we talk about and we think in terms of policy and parity and what actually happens. And some of the things that I saw a lot is, when a culture, there's some assumed roles within each culture. And when I bring that forward and think about surprising things, like I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe. And in Eastern Europe, the women participate in the economy and work in leadership levels far more than they do in the West, which is very interesting. But you think about that leveling of school and that providing of education was not a gender difference.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so, I always had more diverse teams, and I would say diverse meaning there were people from different backgrounds. There were women, there were men, they were, of different cultural backgrounds as a melting pot much more easily outside the US than I have had in the US.
Yeah,
And
that's interesting.
it really is. And I think, I am continually amazed. I look at gender parity and I look at the statistics of where we sit in the world, not only in the development.
51st.
Yeah, yes, 51st, exactly. And you look at political representation, we're 90th. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And when I think about how I approach, some of the things that I teach, and those experiences are, things like, as we just said, did you bring your family, or could you go order us lunch? Or, I had oftentimes one of my most sort of horrific story. I was with a group of men, and it was in Western Europe, in a country that should have been pretty straightforward and pretty forward thinking, I would say. And there was a whole big discussion on hiring a young woman because, she just got married. And I was like, well, what do you mean? Yeah. So, and they said, well, she's going to have children.
Like a ticking time bomb.
Absolutely. And so it was kind of crazy. And so one of the things that I learned to do there for sure is to kind of work through the blind hiring with a lot of people and the blind resumes. Let's talk about, who these people are and what they can contribute.
Mm,
And I understand, there's different parameters. There's a year maternity leave in lots of Europe
mm.
in lots of places in the world. But, that is managed. And I'd say good and bad to that, because the great news is that it is managed and it's expected and it's just a part of rhythm. And, once you get hired and once you kind of get over that, the business adjusts. And I'm
Right.
quite sure that, we could do a very similar adjustment
Mm-hmm.
here.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, if you look at the top 10 on that same list on gender equality across the world, you have Iceland, and the
Right,
Scandinavian countries. You have African countries like
right,
Rwanda, which all those stories are fascinating if you unpack them. But I think the common thread is that they have addressed the motherhood penalty, which we know to be the number one bias affecting women in the workplace today, especially in the U.S. when we don't have guaranteed parental leave.
right.
I didn't know that. So I'm pregnant and tell HR, and this is only 6 years ago. I tell HR I'm pregnant and they say, "Okay, great." And I was like, "So I'll be taking leave and then that's not paid, right?" And I was like, "What?"
Right. Mhm. Right.
And I was just dumbfounded, like, and so you had to file, short-term disability for our
Mhm.
listeners out there. So I made a display of it on my out of office for those 5 weeks. I only did 5 weeks because I couldn't afford to
Yeah.
take any more time, that I'm on short-term disability, and people thought something was wrong with the baby. Like,
Right.
I'm just gonna call it what you told me to call it. Let's be clear, there's no parental leave. Even worse for our fathers, right? And
Oh
so
my gosh. Yes.
what
And
the
I adopted one of my children.
oh, even worse, right? For
Even worse.
policy. Yeah.
Mhm. And that was shocking. I was sort of shocked. I was like, "You're kidding, right?" And the fact that we in the US call it disability
It's
is
it's
mind-boggling.
offensive to people with disabilities. I did not have a disability.
Exactly. And, don't couple that, my goodness, with the fact that we have no awareness of International Women's Day, but everybody knows about Mother's Day. It's
That's
such
a
a
really
dichotomy.
good point.
Yeah, I just think, I am a mother. I have 3 boys, believe it or not. And
Mm.
to celebrate that is a wonderful thing, and I'm passionate about them and I love them. Probably one of the proudest facts I have is my oldest son married a woman who is going to med school.
Aw.
And I, of course, think, oh, good, you married up like your father.
Hey, we pick up those cues from our parents.
That is right. But
That you
but the
bring such a
that
good
we
point.
just, we don't recognize women for our contributions
Yeah.
across the spectrum of our lives is
Mhm.
just, we can't let that go.
Oh my gosh, that point you made about Mother's Day and
Mhm,
International Women's Day is gonna hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd never thought about that.
mhm,
And it really says a lot about our priorities. Women's primary purpose is to be a mother, to be a caregiver, right?
mhm,
Especially in our country, we place so much value on social pressure on that. That
mhm,
the last 3 days, I've been thankful enough to do some self development time myself here. And I've spent time with women at women's events. Almost within the first 5 minutes of any given conversation with a successful woman leader is
mhm.
mom shaming. I'm not doing this enough. I'm not home with my kids tonight. Oh my gosh, my kid fell and I wasn't there. And I just can't believe it. We just fall right into this trap of saying we're not good enough at something that's supposed to be the most important thing. So, of course, the subconscious is going to pick up on that and think, well, we really need to time out on the career, right? And so it's really interwoven the motherhood, but back to what you were saying internationally, um, and with countries that have mandated the year, like Canada has as well, and they're not so great in the ranking list.
Mhm,
The countries that do really well is they have a balanced paternity leave, or right, the choice on how you use between the mother and the father. And so
mhm,
Scandinavian countries, I think it's fascinating. I spent some time in the Netherlands, and one of the things they attribute to closing the gap of gender equality is that they have shared leave, where a lot of times the mother will take the 4-day work week is pretty normal for working parents, and the mother will
mhm.
take Monday or Friday off, and the father will take the other day off. And so the kids are only in daycare or with another caregiver for 3 days a week. That's huge to go from 5 to 3 days. And it
Mhm.
helps with wellness. We know all the stats on this. The more time a mother spends with her child early on, the less time it has for sick leave later on. And so there's a big ripple effect here. And if we're at the same time, we're telling women, be mothers, and that's the primary thing you have to do. But, show up to work and do your job just the same. It's really
Right.
a tug of war. I mean, it's very confusing messages for a woman, especially here in the States, to process.
Well, one of the things that I am really focused on also with that in mind is I think that we are making a big deal of policies and hiring policies to address the gender gap. We are not addressing workplace because if you think about it, the workplace that we all consider as an average workplace was developed after World War II and with men and with a husband that was a bread earner and a wife that stayed at home, and that was how that work day and that cadence of work was developed.
Yep, the Mad Men era.
Right. And that is not the reality that we live in today. And so, one of the things that I focus most definitely when I talk with, I do what we call bold labs, which is those sorts of seminars. And I talk about things like work environment and how that is set up and how it's perceived, because I'm very sure that you can have all the policies in the world, but that doesn't change the way those are executed and the culture within the business that allow that different
Yeah.
approach and different execution.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, we are still the workplace. I mean, it's not that much different than 1950. I
Mm-mm.
think it was structured, very military-esque chain of command, structure, process, don't question leadership. And that's very much a baby boomer mentality that's still, with them largely leading the workforce today, that we're led by. And we're starting to see ripples of change there with how offices are designed, casual dress, remote working, collaborative workspaces. But it's been a slow shift, and it has been one where women were very, very invisible in those old workspaces, and the rules that we're living by in corporate America are still very much the same, the ones that behoove men. And not that men are the problem. I like men. I'm married to one, right? We're fans of men, but
Right.
we need you as allies. We need you to help us with this, because if you care about a woman and you care about these issues,
Mhm.
this is your chance to step up and be an ally. So I'm curious, Kate, in the work that you do, and I know diversity and inclusion isn't you have a different take on that, right? So I'm
I do.
curious, where do you see the future of this work going, and what would you rather have diversity and inclusion called?
Well, I think about diversity and inclusion, and this again is my probably my corporate baggage. I think of that as a lot of times being in human resource function, it gets pushed into human resource. And my perspective, not being in human resource, is that that is a company, almost a risk mitigation area. That is their role, and it is not necessarily an employee advocate. And I
Mhm.
think that, that is executed in different ways in different companies. So I don't want to be particularly offensive, but I also think that, as we push for more gender equity, we need to think about this in terms of balance and belonging.
Mhm.
Because when you balance, if you're managing a balanced team, that's a skill that you have to learn, and it's a skill you have to employ and be conscious about it. So, you balance your budget, you have marketing balance, you understand your audience. Why don't you understand what a balanced team looks like in your business?
Right. Right.
And I think that's a different take on it. So it is not, because when we talk about diversity, we assume that that is a traditional workplace, as you said, militaristic, made for the man, that we're implying that we are trying to have something more diverse than the normal versus let's talk about it in a balanced way, because the balance could become the normal workplace
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
employs people everywhere. And then I also think about belonging, because certainly a lot of my career, I had to learn in foreign lands, what you say doesn't really matter. It's what is heard that matters.
So
And
true.
so, and there's different vocabulary. And so when I think about inclusion versus belonging, that hits me the same way. I think, it doesn't matter that I am trying to be inclusive. If someone doesn't feel like they belong, it doesn't matter what my intention was. You're not going to be successful. And so I really think about, setting business strategies and people management strategies so that you really focus on, do people belong and what does it take to have them feel like they belong? And the leaders are managing a balanced team. And I think that's a little bit different.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm thankful you used the word balance um, differently than how I've he heard it used around work-life balance. And that's just exhausting because you're looking
It's
to equal out a teeter-totter that just keeps going back and forth. Balance doesn't
yeah,
exist. But
no.
balance with teams, right? And I think that's where diversity, where we've struggled, is you're gonna ebb and flow with a diverse representation on your team. What you want is a balanced perspective, right? You want different types of perspectives because we know we make better decisions, have more innovation, better business results. But to your point about belonging, I mean, we also know there's so much data on this that people want to work in places where they feel like they belong.
Mhm.
Aha. And we don't stay places we don't feel like we belong. And so I think for our listeners, I'm starting to see a lot of diversity and inclusion titles shift to belonging, to your point.
Mhm.
And I welcome that as well because it sounds fluffy, but it's absolutely rings true with why good people are leaving organizations. And at the heart of diversity and inclusion, that's what it's about. I mean, it really is about that business case, wanting to retain and hire the best possible humans and have the most diverse representation so that you can make those good decisions. So good take on that, Kate. Well, we're kind of nearing the end of our time together. Sadly enough, I'm still reeling this Mother's Day thing. I'm so many ideas about this now, approaching International Women's Day.
Right?
Oh boy. So we've always got work to do in this space, right? That's what keeps me excited. It's always changing. I
Yeah.
always say it's a journey, not a destination. Um, so Kate, if you could just pinpoint a key learning, a key idea, a key action step, choose your own adventure for our listeners out there that are, okay, this is great, but what do I do? What would you offer to them?
There's a couple of things I would. I'm very focused on people taking action as you talked about in my bio in terms of what Be Bold Now is about. And I would absolutely encourage them, no matter where you sit, be conscious about your dollars, your engagement, and think through, are there businesses in your area that you could do business that are women owned or in support of women? Are there organizations that you can support with time, materials, funding, whatever it is, that are in support of women? And make that conscious shift, because I think that, as we think about our place in the world and we're normalizing and changing in all of our lives, we can take action no matter where we are. Women represent 50% of the population and an increasing number of the spending dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think from a consumer standpoint, that is a really important piece.
Mm-hmm.
And from a business standpoint, I think that women oftentimes sit back and don't speak up. And I don't think that, I am not advocating being adversarial or combative, but it is really thinking through strategies where you sit, you could improve things. I see women every day that sit in meetings and don't talk. Even to raise their voice in a meeting, to me, is a bold action. It's
Yeah.
not always about changing the world. It's recognize that, your contribution matters, every bit of it in your own life, and move forward. Because, one of the things that I talk to about women, you talk to them and you say, are you aligned with this? And this is how you feel. And we all feel the same. We all find common ground. We don't all agree necessarily on every point, but we can find common ground and support one another, and make those moves forward, even small ones, and don't be afraid to do that. That is,
Yeah.
I'm very enthusiastic about women doing that.
Yeah, it really is the subtle things. It doesn't have to be this big, momentous, huge thing. Just break it into some small baby steps. And to your point, Kate, remind yourself that you have a message to share. By not sharing your idea at a meeting or not speaking up when you have a better solution, like, the team loses out. Everybody's losing out from that. And I think as women, a lot of times that mental self-talk of like, "Yeah, my idea's not good enough," that can kinda help you get through it in the moment. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen if I share this idea?
That's
Yeah.
exactly. It doesn't matter how balanced your team that you are sitting on if you don't use that balance.
Right.
And
Right.
so if you have, 50% women, but they don't participate at that 50%, it
Mhm.
doesn't matter what it looks like on paper. In reality, the culture is not going to change in your workplace or in
Yep.
your life.
They're not gonna stay. Yep.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Well, Kate, this has been so enjoyable. I'm so thankful to have you on and to share your story. How can our listeners connect with you?
They can connect with me at Be Bold Now, and the website is bboldnow.com. Or they're very welcome to reach out to me at kate at bboldnow.com. And I want to wish everyone a very happy International Women's Day.
Mm.
You know, officially, International Women's Day is the 8th of March. It comes every year like Christmas, and it sort of kicks off my holiday season, I have to admit.
Yeah, we're busy in March. So it is a busy month for us, and it is
Exactly.
be fun. It is like our Christmas.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And it's so, it is a celebration. There are events listed in lots of cities on the UN International Women's Day site. And so just check that out.
Well, we might have to schedule this episode to air on that date. I'm thinking, especially with the great insights that you gave on it in comparison to Mother's Day. So I really appreciate that perspective, Kate. And happy International Women's Day to you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being on again. Great message. Enjoy your work. Did you know that you can find all 5 seasons of our 50 plus episodes at nextpivotpoint.com? There, you can sign up for our complimentary 7-day preview of our new program, Lead Like an Ally, and order our new book, Lead Like an Ally. I appreciate you listening to this episode. Who do you know that needs to hear this message? Simply hit the share button. Also, we're looking for reviews. Those are helpful so listeners can find us. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Julie Kratz. I post every single day. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together. We are one.